Welcome to the UDO work session with the Charlotte City Council on June 27th. The purpose of this meeting is to hold a unified development ordinance session with Mayor and Council to get the information, the questions laid out before everyone as we proceed in this process. The UDO is an important step as we implement this Charlotte 2040 Comprehensive Plan and consolidates 8 sets of regulations written at different times over the past 30 years. I thought we've been talking about this almost for 30 years. But the topics that the staff has prepared for us, and if there's anything that you want to hear more about, we can certainly text that to the team so that they can know that this is something more that you'd like to discuss. Our updates on the key changes since the second draft, what we've heard from the community since the second draft, and findings from the economic impact analysis and site feasibility analysis performed on the UDO and the Comprehensive Transportation Review. How the UDO and the Comprehensive Transportation Review work together to implement the mobility goals that we have. And in the next steps, we'll spend some time, Ms. Craig will spend some time talking about how the procedural plans for the review and the council vote on August the 22nd. So before we start with that, I'd like to have introductions, and because most of the council members are virtual, we'll start with those attending virtually. And so if we can have introductions from those, we'll start with our District 1 rep, and welcome back.
Thank you very much. Happy Monday. Larkin Eggleston, District 1.
Malcolm Graham, District 2.
Matt Newton, District 5.
Clark McCarty, District 6.
Ed Driggs, District 7.
All right. We do not have a quorum yet for this meeting, and we're working to contact
Madam
other
Mayor.
council members. Do we have?
I apologize. Yes, Mr. Phipps is on. Mr. Phipps, if you can introduce yourself.
Mr. Phipps, if you would introduce yourself.
Greg Phipps at large.
All right, so we now have a quorum. I'd also like to introduce the folks that are in the room that are participating with us today. We'll start with our Deputy City Clerk.
Billy Tons, Deputy City Clerk.
Vi Lyles, Mayor.
Allison Craig, Interim Planning Director.
Laura Harmon, Planning Department.
Ed McKinney, CDOT.
David Green, Perkins and Will.
Donata Jackson, Office of Constituent Services.
Liz Babson, CDOT. Candace Rory, Planning.
So this meeting is available or do we have other people to be introduced? Okay, hold on.
Alan Goodwin, Planning.
Yolanda Jones, Planning. Sandra Montgomery, Planning.
Okay. Those are the support systems and the staff that are in the room today. I just also want to note that this meeting has been noticed and is available on the various media platforms that the city includes. So with that, we'll go ahead and start, and we'll turn this meeting over to Allison Craig.
Thank you, Mayor. Good morning, Mayor, members of council. Really appreciate you taking the time this morning to have a morning session to cover important information on the UDO as we move towards the public hearing and a request for adoption. We have a lot of material to cover today, but it's important. Today we've got 4 presenters to cover 3 topics that all tell a story of a second draft UDO that I believe has put us in a place where we are advancing policies of the 2040 Comprehensive Plan, providing a set of regulations that are easier to understand than today's complicated set of outdated ordinances, and supports economic vitality in our city. Laura will provide an update on what we've heard from the community and key changes made in the second draft, particularly on items covered in the economic impact analysis. We spent a great deal of time with council, with the community, and with different stakeholder groups, and feel as though the second draft of the UDO finds the right balance of protecting neighborhood character, providing predictability in the development process, and new ideas to advance important city priorities like affordable housing. Then our consultants will present on the economic impact analysis and site feasibility testing for the UDO. This work has been very helpful in shaping the second draft, and the findings presented today have been updated based on this new draft. What you will hear from them is that the UDO advances our comprehensive plan goals, and while in some cases there may be increased investment required under the UDO, these are important to advance city climate, mobility, and tree canopy goals, and they are balanced by increases in development potential, yield, and efficiency. Finally, Ed will discuss how the work CDOT is doing with the street manual, particularly the comprehensive transportation review, and how it works hand in hand with the UDO to improve multimodal investment in our communities and demonstrate how this will be applied to development projects. And as the mayor mentioned at the end of the meeting, after council discussion on these items and before we adjourn, we'd like to discuss some logistics for the July 11th public hearing. And with that, I will turn it over to Laura, the UDO project manager.
Thank you, Allison. I think we've covered this. Thank you, Allison. I think we've covered this for the most part. Just to recap, we did release the second draft UDO, which is also the public hearing draft, on Friday, June the 3rd, and it is available on our website at www.charlotteudo.org. I think we've covered the topics for today, so next slide. Some of the key dates with the UDO is we will have a public hearing 2 weeks from today on the UDO Tree Ordinance Amendment and the Charlotte Streets Manual. On July the 19th, the UDO will be going to the Planning Committee of the Planning Commission, where we'll be requesting a recommendation. We will, on August 15th or before, release the UDO adoption draft and come to council on the 22nd requesting UDO adoption. Next slide. So with the first draft, we received a large number of comments from community members and stakeholders, over 1,200 comments. We also spoke with council a few times. Our planning commission received feedback from you all in the planning commission, went to our UDO advisory committee, and also received 600 plus comments from city and county staff as we were really working to get to the public hearing draft. And the second draft builds off the first draft, but does include some new and updated concepts and approaches. A few of those we'll go over today. Next slide. On the second draft, a little bit about the public input process. We have held a number of sessions to date, some virtual update sessions to explain the changes on June 14th and the 16th. On the 15th, we had an open house here at the Government Center, and we have had virtual office hours on the 21st, 22nd, and 23rd, and we'll wrap that up tomorrow, where people can come in one-on-one or small groups and talk through topics. Staff will then respond to the feedback and summarize the comments for City Council and the Planning Commission, particularly the Planning Committee. Next slide. So some of the changes, and it appears that maybe we're, there we go, say, out of order. Next slide, please. I think we're going backwards. Next slide. We have on the second draft received comments, though not nearly as many as we had on the first draft. Some of the things that we have heard about and through the online portal or virtual and in-person meetings are questions about heritage trees and some suggestion that maybe we're not asking for enough in that area. Another area we've heard a lot about is height. Whether folks like the new height transition that we'll show you all in a minute, didn't like it, some questions about increasing height in some of the other districts. We've also received a number of kind of individual questions from individuals where we didn't really see a theme, but we are taking those comments. We'll be wrapping up comments this week and then consolidating them and providing, as I said earlier, feedback to council on what we've heard in our response to those comments. Next slide. So now we want to talk to you all a bit about Some of the changes we made between the first and second draft, we'll just go through these quickly and later be able to answer questions if you're interested. We added, first off, a fourth campus zoning district called the Research Campus District. We had a lot of discussion during the policy map about the need for an additional district, so we did develop that, and that is the fourth campus district. It allows large-scale research campuses with a mix of uses not allowed in the other campus districts. So greater flexibility on what goes on and really geared towards large campus environments with taller structures and pedestrian-oriented development. Next slide. We revised the sidewall height restrictions in the neighborhood 1 zoning districts from 12 to 20 feet, so that's the side of the building, or it could be higher depending on if your neighbors are higher than the 20-foot height. We did this because we'd heard that the 12-foot restriction really didn't allow two-story duplexes and triplexes, and that was important because a lot of times on smaller lots, we need to go to a second story to allow those to occur. We also added some standards for residential driveways so that we could work on compatibility in established neighborhoods, allowing up to 2 driveways along a frontage with a total driveway width, total width of driveways of 24 feet, and this applies to all of the uses in the N1 districts, single-family duplex, triplex, and quadruplex. So I mentioned earlier, we've gotten some feedback on height transition, both folks who like this and some who have some concerns about it. We did change the height transition, which in the first draft was 65 feet within 200 feet of a neighborhood 1 place type. And then after that, allowing development to be as tall as the zoning allows. The second draft says that in the first 100 feet, we would limit to 50 feet and then to 65 feet within the next 100, and after that to the height allowed in the district. And we really believe this is a better transition to our established neighborhoods, but still allows height fairly quickly at 200 feet to be able to go up to the district maximum. In conjunction with that, we also increased the maximum height in some of our districts to provide greater height where we think it's most important, further away from the neighborhoods. Height increases were from 5 to 50 feet, and you can see there are a number of districts where we increased the height. We added new bonus menu options for the height bonus, providing a provision for affordable housing at 60% of area median income. Before, we only had a provision if you were at 80%. We added EV charging stations when someone is installing above the UDO requirements. Also have standards for allowances for multimodal transportation mitigation and transportation demand management, where people can get increased height if they meet certain standards through CDOT on those last 2 items. And we think these were opportunities to really align with the city priorities and goals and provide more options for getting the additional height through the height bonus. Another thing that we added, and planning worked with a number of departments, particularly housing and neighborhood services, are new affordable housing allowances that if you provide 15% of your units at 60% AMI or 30% at 80% AMI or lower, or 20% at 80% in areas of high housing costs, for a total of a 30-year affordability period, you can use the incentives on the left, and those really deal with ability to go to a different zoning standards, and you can actually use all of these. Flexibility in preserving right-of-way in lieu of constructing a street when that street really is not needed in the near term. The ability to use the Tier 1 green area credits, that's out of the tree regulations in the ordinance, and that Tier 1 has the greatest flexibility. Also, flexibility on planting 2 times the mitigation trees in lieu of providing the mitigation fee. And finally, reimbursement of cost of constructing sidewalks, and that's when you do 20% of your units at 60% AMI or less for 15 years. And that last standard is based on state requirements. So that's why it's a little bit different. Worked with Mecklenburg County Park and Rec and the county manager's office on a new standard or options for dedicating land to Park and Rec or providing a fee in lieu or a combination thereof to meet open space requirements as an option, not a requirement, but an option that people can choose if that works for their site. And we think we've gotten to a good place. We have some more work on the implementation of this that we'll be doing with Park and Rec. We also heard a lot about how we have a lot of different types of open areas, and we needed clarity on when they could overlap. And so we provided that in this draft, and you can see the number of different types of open areas, and we have clarified when different ones, which is in most cases allowed to overlap, as long as we're meeting the intent and the standards of each type. Next slide. We heard a lot in the first draft about the cost of providing electric vehicle charging stations. So we did remove the requirement for 10% for EV ready. That was a type of EV charging station scenario that was fairly costly but didn't actually give you the charging station. So this removed a fair amount of cost, we believe. We modified the definition of EV capable, and also wanted to point out that Duke Energy's Make Ready program can be used to defray costs associated with installing EV charging stations. Parking, we had a lot of conversation on parking with council and others, so where we've ended up is fairly similar to where we were in the first draft, though with some tweaks to that. We did work on consolidating standards for uses, so it was an easier table to read. We reduced minimums somewhat for non-residential uses in the Tier 1 and Tier 2, which were the least intense. Development areas, typically no changes for minimums in Tier 1 for residential uses, and this is where Neighborhood 1 is in the Tier 1. We did increase the distance for certain requirements for minimum parking in Tier 3 when you're near Neighborhood 1. And initially that was at 200 feet from Neighborhood 1 place type, changed to 400 feet. And that's for a limited number of uses, but where there is concern about spillover into the neighborhood. So restaurants, bars, and other residential, if you're that close to Neighborhood 1, would be required to provide some parking. And then finally, we added a standard that says that any development within a half-mile walk of an existing transit station, and that would be, at this point in time, our light rail, Blue Line and Blue Line extension. If you are within that half-mile walk, you can use the Tier 3 standards, which are the lowest standards we have, even if the zoning district doesn't fall into that tier, as long as the development is not located in the Neighborhood 1 place type. But for all other place types, you can use those Tier 3 standards, which would allow less parking.
Laura, can I ask a quick question about that?
Certainly.
I'm sorry, just because I think it's technical. I don't want to wait to the end. Even if the development is not located in Neighborhood 1 place type, but what if it's located right next door to Neighborhood 1 place type?
You would, great question, you would still have to provide some parking if you're within that 400-foot buffer.
The 400 feet?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
So yes, you would, and that is part of the Tier 3 standard, so you would have to meet that.
All right, thank you.
You're welcome. And finally, want to talk briefly about trees. We have two scenarios for trees. One is when trees are being impacted through development. We call that the land development heritage tree protection, and that will be included in the UDO. And then we also have situations where heritage trees are being impacted or removed not through development, but simply through activity of a property owner. Then they're not doing development on their site, and that will be in the amended tree ordinance. And so I'll briefly go through some of the highlights of the changes for land development or development-related activity. In the first draft, there was, you were required to preserve a heritage tree unless there was no other reasonable location. But in the second draft, removal is allowed if there's a demonstrated conflict. So that is more flexible in the second draft. The mitigation fee has gone up from $1,000 per tree removed plus one tree planted to $1,500, and one tree planted, and each additional tree planted will reduce that fee by $250. So that's a quick highlight of what is in those standards. And then on the next slide, for non-land development activity, which again will be in the amended tree ordinance, this is where a property owner, again, is removing a tree, but not because of land development activity, but because they have a desire to move that tree. Preservation in the first draft was required unless there was no other reasonable location. In the second draft, we simply say that removal is allowed. The mitigation fee in the first draft was $1,000 per tree, and one tree planted has been reduced in the second draft to $500 per tree and one tree planted. And then each additional tree planted can reduce that fee by $250. So some pretty significant changes in adding flexibility as we're looking at heritage trees for the first time in our ordinances. And with that, I turn this over to Matt Prosser, who is providing an update on the UDO economic analysis.
Yes, thanks, Laura. Hi, everyone. Good to be with you. I'm Matt Prosser with Economic and Planning Systems. I led the development of an economic analysis related to the UDO, and so I'll be walking through our approach and findings. Next slide. So just a reminder to you all, this is a pretty fundamental change to the way new development is guided in the city. Both with the introduction of the comprehensive plan, the related policy map, and then ultimately this UDO will be the instrument for implementing many of the provisions within the plan and the policy map. And so there's great opportunity for creating the types of desired development that are wanted in the community. And so our goal through this analysis, working with David Green, with Perkins and Will, was to really understand how the UDO is directing developments in relation to the desired outcomes that are within the plan and the policy map, and then analyzing how that impacts feasibility and potential for development in the city. So next slide. So our approach was to work collaboratively with the development community to first identify both prototypical projects and then specific case studies of projects that have been built or being built in the community that are good examples of development. And to understand what the programs and inputs for these different projects were, and then understand the impacts on both design and financial feasibility as a result of the UDO. And so there is both an economic study and a design study final report that are provided. As I mentioned, I'm presenting the economic study findings, where David Green will follow me with the design study findings. Next slide. And so we went through a number of different analyses to evaluate different issues. And really our biggest focus was understanding what the impacts on what we're calling yield is, or the amount of development that can be built on a parcel based on UDO. And then also looking on implications on project cost. So what are increases or decreases for the cost of development as a result of the UDO, and evaluating those impacts on feasibility and from a physical and financial perspective. Next slide. As you may know, we've worked with several development community members throughout the process. We organized everyone into 5 different groups that focused on different types of development, from employment types to mixed use, neighborhoods, adapted reuse, and then we had a affordable housing specific group that of course touched on a number of different contexts in terms of the products that could be affordable. In total, we had, I think, nearly 20 meetings through the process with the development community, evaluating projects, gaining input, and discussing results. Next slide. For our economic analysis, we developed pro formas for each of the different prototype and case study projects that were evaluated, gathering inputs from the development community, inputting those into pro forma models, and then illustrating the financial impact, both looking at multiple return measures, specifically looking at the impacts on the yield on cost and the project returns for each project that we evaluate. Next slide. And so I want to share with you our findings. So we have 3 major findings that we identified. So the first one, and I'll walk through each of these after I present these. The first one is we believe there will be more by right developments allowed in the city after the initial alignment, rezoning, and community area planning efforts are complete. So really a shift to allowing projects that the community wants to see happen quicker without the need for conditional zoning districts or negotiations through rezoning processes. The second finding is that we think that there's greater development potential on the whole than there are in the current ordinances. So we're allowing more development to occur, especially in places that we want it to. And then lastly, we do think that there will be an increased level of investment required or cost for each project in most by right conditions. And we'll walk through some of the specifics related to that. And really, I think that's a product of shifting the requirements you've been getting through rezonings and conditional districts into a framework will allow them to be incorporated into by right projects right away. Next slide. So first, talking about process improvements and more by right developments, the UDO consolidates and updates several ordinances into one place that is more user-friendly. And ultimately, as the city is rezoned through the alignment rezoning and further evaluated through community planning process, we think there'll be more opportunity for by right development, as well as there are other provisions like the UDO administrator that help navigate projects through the process and alleviate conflicts where previously there may have been hangups. This chart on the right illustrates new apartment projects that were built in the last 3 years within the city. And as you can see, over 40% of projects needed a conditional zoning district to be built. And this doesn't also include rezonings to conventional districts. And so what the UDO is hoping to achieve is reducing greatly the number of projects that would need this type of conditional zoning and allowing them to happen through the traditional by right process. Next slide. As I mentioned, we also think there's greater development capacity. I think that occurs through 2 ways. First, through the implementation of the policy map and ultimately the alignment rezoning. The policy map, as you likely know, shifts our development capacity from more single-use place types like residential or employment place types to mixed use. And what that does is it creates greater capacity for higher density development, specifically multifamily housing shown on the bottom chart. And so what we've done is allow for greater potential to accommodate the growth that is expected for the community over the planned horizon. And the UDO will implement this through these changes to the zone districts and where they are designated. Next slide. We also think the specific standards, the specific standards within the UDO also create increased development capacity, and David Green will go into this in a little more detail in a minute. But where we see the greatest impact, and we've been focusing on housing because we think that's where the most impact occurs in terms of creating more capacity for growth. But through the allowance of more different housing types like duplexes and triplexes in neighborhood 1 areas, we were increasing capacity for single family attached housing. And then through density and height provisions in the draft or in the draft UDO, we also think there's an increased potential in multifamily housing development as well. And those areas shown in red on this chart illustrate the estimated increase that we could directly attribute to the UDO. There may be more additional capacity that we couldn't directly attribute. Next slide. So what I want to do is talk through some of the issues that may impact this potential capacity that were brought up through the process. So Laura mentioned the sidewall height issue for duplexes and triplexes in neighborhood 1 context. It was set at 12 feet in the first draft of the UDO and has been changed to 20. We've found, working with the development community, this would be a significant impediment to duplexes, specifically on narrower lots. So anything really under 70 feet in width would really greatly impact the potential to use to build a duplex on a lot. So this was a pretty impactful change that will allow that potential capacity we illustrated on the previous slide to occur. Next slide. Other changes related to capacity. There was the provision to use a conservation residential development alternative for neighborhood 1, which allows more flexibility in lot sizes in exchange for the placement of open space or increase in open space. The first draft required a 10-acre site minimum to use this provision. And this has been reduced to 2 acres to match current ordinances, but also to reflect the reality that a lot of the development potential in the community is for smaller lots more and more going forward. Laura also talked about more flexibility related to parking and access to duplexes and triplexes. This added flexibility will help support the development of these product types, but also continue to preserve the character of the neighborhoods that these housing units will be built in. Next slide. And then one of the biggest things we heard throughout the process was the impact of heritage trees from the development community. The changes to the second draft greatly reduced the impacts that were identified. There was a lot of concern from the development community that within the first draft, a lot of sites would not be able to be developed because of this provision, as well as there would be upfront costs and impacts on project yield because of it. The ability to document the conflict and build, even if there is heritage trees, is a great improvement to the potential constraints. There will still be added costs related to needing to do tree surveys and to mitigate heritage trees on sites, but the major impediments will no longer prevent development because of the requirement. Next slide. A new provision, as Laura mentioned, was the addition of this height transition from areas that are adjacent to neighborhood place types. And so we did not evaluate this initially in our analysis because it is a new provision in the second draft, but did an analysis once the second draft came out. And what we found was there, on average, a parcel that is impacted may have a reduction of up to 8% of potential yield as a result of having to lose a floor of height in for that first 50 to 100 feet of the site. And at a high level estimate, we think that would potentially, at the highest level, reduce capacity by 4% on these parcels. So about a 1,800 unit reduction in capacity. That still is only a portion of the added capacity that we had found in that previous slide for multifamily. So don't find this to be significantly impacting provision in terms of capacity, and also did not create significant financial feasibility issues on average for projects. Now, site-specific projects might have more concerns, but for the prototypical site, the impact did not create an infeasible project. Next slide. The last thing I want to touch on is the requirement for increased investment, so cost for development. We do think both drafts do increase costs for by right development in certain areas, specific to heritage trees, open space, green area, and electric vehicle charging. We do think the second draft greatly reduces these impacts and also adds provisions to support affordable housing projects, which was a really fruitful outcome of our affordable housing group that we had formed. I'll walk through a few of these quickly. Next slide. The green area and open space requirements were largely additive in the first draft. As Laura mentioned, they specified specific ways that these two areas can overlap, which greatly reduced the total need in many cases. And also added provision for a land dedication fee in lieu or alternative for open space, which creates more development flexibility. And so while providing green area may increase costs in some cases, there's greater flexibility to implement different projects. And David will talk through this shortly. Next slide. Another major issue is the electric vehicle charging stations. As Laura mentioned, the requirement for 10% EV ready spaces has been dropped. So the total requirement for a project dropped from 32% to 22% for larger projects. We do think this is an impactful change. There still will be added costs. The cost on a prototypical apartment project was about 1.3% total increase in cost. This is reduced to 0.9% based on the change in the ordinance. And so an improvement, but something to monitor in terms of the actual need and use of these spaces and the requirement to have EV capable spaces required as technologies change. Next slide. And then lastly, I wanted to touch on the affordable housing specific changes. As I said, we feel are pretty fruitful changes coming out of the group. The first draft had provisions for neighborhood one place types that allow for the use of greater density or higher intensity zone districts for affordable projects. So if you're in neighborhood 1A, you can use neighborhood 1B standards. The suggestion was to apply this to neighborhood 2 and NC districts. And so the second draft provides a fair amount of flexibility of using different zone districts when you're in those place types that best fit affordable projects, which really creates more flexibility, which we found was more often more impactful than actual increases in density for affordable specific projects. So traditional affordable projects, not just mixed income projects. There also are some provisions related to the reduction in costs that Laura went through, which are great additions as well as changes to the bonus menu that will help create more incentive for on-site development, as well as increased yield for the fee in lieu for affordable housing bonuses, which will benefit the city's efforts. So with that, I'll turn it over to David Green to walk through the design study.
Hello, everyone. So I'm going to run through quickly the analysis that we did to support the economic evaluations that Matt just went through. I do want to say that we did a fairly robust, detailed analysis, and two things I'm going to focus on today in this presentation are the prototype sites and the actual sites. Next slide, please. I also just wanted to let everyone know that we did model over 300 scenarios for prototype and actual sites, and this is pretty unique in the process of adopting a zoning code or a zoning ordinance. So I just wanted to point that out, that there's something that's being done in Charlotte, which is a little bit different and unique in a positive way. Next slide. So in the prototype sites, what we're really looking at is evaluating development that can occur under the proposed Unified Development Ordinance versus what can happen with the current ordinance. And so we used a translation table, which is part of the UDO, which aligns existing zoning categories with proposed zoning categories, and that was the baseline that allowed us to understand the differences. We then modeled each of these different categories across a number of different criteria so that we could understand its impact on density, height, open space, parking, as well as some other specific issues that Matt and Laura both talked about. In this particular, next slide, please. In this particular case, we had some fairly clear outcomes, some fairly clear findings relative to yield. By and large, the UDO provides greater residential density. This is for single family. It also provides greater multifamily density. This is units per acre. It also provides bonus density opportunities that are not present in the current ordinance, which gives it more flexibility and more opportunity for increased yield in relation to benefits that are going back to the community. For height, we saw the UDO providing an increased height over current ordinance in most cases. This is not true across the board. The UDO provides additional development yield in certain areas to offset baseline reductions in height. And so one thing we did find is that where we had lower height standards in the UDO, in many cases those yields or lower yields were offset through more flexible design criteria. It was also offset by bonus height opportunities that are not present in the current ordinance. So for both yield and height, we found that the bonus opportunities offered a lot of potential yield increases as well as flexibility in design. For open space and green area, notwithstanding the changes that were made in the overlapping of the second draft of the UDO does by and large require greater open space and green area than in some of the districts. I would say the majority of the districts in the current ordinance, although this does align with the comprehensive plan. So it is doing what it needs to do. It also necessitates alternative open space or green area locations in higher density commercial projects. And so in this case, when you have higher density projects, you're actually needing to rely on alternatives in terms of meeting the standards for for open space and green area, primarily things like locating on the roof or fee in lieu options. Next slide. And so we've taken all of this data and we've laid it out in a series of charts that are hopefully fairly easy to understand. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time going through these, but I did want to capture the major outcomes from each of these. And so this is a density comparison in dwelling units per acre. So this is residential density. And what you can see in the baseline in orange is the current ordinance. This tells you the amount of development you can get in each of the zoning districts currently. You then have a green line, which is the first draft of the UDO, and then the gray dashed line is the second draft of the UDO, and then the orange line is telling you what you can get with a bonus. And what this is describing by and large is that the UDO is giving you more yield for residential dwelling with a couple of outliers that we can get into if necessary. And that the second draft is actually increasing that. And the important piece that you'll see consistently through these slides is that there was already a beneficial increase with the first draft of the UDO, and the second draft of the UDO, almost without exception, increased the beneficial returns on these areas. And then further, just to say that in some of these areas where there were still inconsistencies, the bonuses helped align these more clearly. So I'm not going to spend as much time on the next slides, but in the next slide, you'll see the same sort of outcome for non-residential development. And so again, starting with the baseline, seeing beneficial outcomes with a couple of outliers for both the UDO's first draft and second draft, and then the alignment with the bonus. And so this just gives you a really good snapshot that's completely data-driven, that describes the specifics of the values in terms of each of these specific zoning categories. Next slide. This is also seen in height, and you can see that there's a kind of consistency in the height with a minor increase in UDO Draft 1 and UDO Draft 2, but there's an expanded opportunity for increased height where it's appropriate. I will say this doesn't include areas that are within 100 feet of single-family, of N1 place types, or within even greater distances for the 65-foot cap. So we're both increasing height in the areas that it's appropriate and still protecting the N1 place types. Next slide. And then there's a little bit of a different story with the open space comparison and green area required. And this has to do with the idea that in all cases, what's happening is the UDO is trying to make a more consistent set of standards for open space and green area. And you see this across the board. The one place where it drops a little bit is industrial area, which requires less open space than other districts for certain reasons that are fairly self-evident. And there's a kind of average to this, but it does mean that in certain zoning categories, there is going to be an increase in open space requirements in green area, and this primarily affects the centers, the higher density areas, mixed-use areas, but there is also a greater flexibility in terms of the way that this can be mitigated. And I will say that one of the beneficial changes in the second draft of the UDO was a fee in lieu for both open space and green area, and what this allows us to do is meet the requirements of the comprehensive plan and get better open space for public use, such as parks, through this funding opportunity without detrimentally impacting the physical developability of sites. Next slide, please. And then I just wanted to point out that, that in addition to the zoning categories in the UDO, in the translation table, there are a number of additional categories. And this is simply to demonstrate that even with the translation table and that analysis, there was greater flexibility and opportunity for increase in yield in appropriate places. But it's further enhanced and further promoted in the UDO through these additional zoning categories, which can be adopted relative to specific place types in the comprehensive plan. Next slide. So we also looked at actual sites, and this was important. Next slide, please, because working with the development community and stakeholder groups, we needed to understand what the real impact of this was. So we modeled hundreds of different hundreds of different scenarios across the prototype sites to understand the general differences between the two. But we wanted to make sure that if we were looking at the best projects, the best examples of projects across the city, that we would be able to do those by right under the UDO. And so we followed a similar methodology as we did with the prototype, except in this case, we were actually using as the baseline projects that were either planned and approved, that were deemed as beneficial projects, or projects that had been built that were generally deemed by the largest sort of cohort of citizens as beneficial. We looked at the same issues: height, density, open space, parking, and included in this also back of curb. Next slide, please. And so we had very similar yields, very similar findings to the prototype. I do want to point out a couple of slight differences. One thing that we were looking at, and this is really important to understand, is that we were evaluating the existing parcels or the existing projects in such a way that analyzed whether or not you could build the exact same project under the proposed UDO without having to go through any kind of conditional zoning. We also analyzed each of these parcels if you were to build the same project type but follow more closely the guidelines of the UDO, what would the impact be? And so in most cases, yes, you could build the exact same project by and large with some small deviations, but you could also build it differently following the guidelines and get higher yield and better outcomes. And so this is really important because it's demonstrating at a specific project level that the UDO both accommodates things that have already been built to a great extent, but also aligns with or increases yield and benefit over what was required to previously be conditionally rezoned. And that goes to the heart of the initial assertion that Matt was making. And so you can see that these general findings follow the same findings that we had for the prototype, which is good because it means that the evaluation of the prototype is actually being tested and proven to some extent through the evaluation of these specific sites. Next slide, please. And so we saw this in a new office project on Caswell. evaluating all of the different criteria, you could build this project exactly as it is under the UDO, and you could actually get more yield out of this if it was redesigned with certain stipulations, with the one caveat of a reduction in open space and green area, which could be bought out as fee in lieu, and that was included in Matt's economic analysis. Next slide, please. Same with the very nice multifamily project on Harding. Again, everything is in alignment by and large between the current UDO, the proposed UDO and the current ordinance. You can get additional development if you're looking at redesigning the project, which we did. Again, the same challenge with open space and green area, although I will point out on this one, the open space that was used in the conditional rezoning is actually located on the roof in 2 different areas, and so there is some precedent for this, although there would still need to be some fee in lieu to make this work. You can also see that parking works in all of these scenarios as well. Next slide, please. And then another project on Selwyn, same thing. This project is a little bit different because it is directly adjacent to an N1 neighborhood, and in the second evaluation of the UDO, you will see that there was a reduction in the overall development or the overall yield. However, that's still above the yield that is in place in the project as it is. This one was the only example that we had where we had a reduction in height, and so you wouldn't be able to build a 75-foot tall building, which was conditionally rezoned under the MUDD. You would be able to build a 65-foot building, and in this case, you would also have to meet the 50-foot transitional height from the N1 place type. But what this demonstrates in a very clear way is that you could build this project not exactly as it is, but yielding the same number of units, the same amount of gross square footage, with a slight reconfiguration, meeting the criteria and standards of the UDO. So we think that what we're seeing here is that there is, by and large, alignment between the goals and the outcomes. Next slide, please. And so there are just a couple of example charts here as well. And in this one, you can see that we were looking at the baseline, which was the current project is built, analysis 1, which was understanding could we build that project under the UDO and where did we get variation. Analysis 2 was could we build this under the first draft of the UDO, and then analysis 3 was could we build this under the second draft of the UDO. And I'll point out Selwyn, which is where that first arrow is. And you can see that what happened there is we were able to yield a higher intensity of development with UDO Draft 1, where we didn't have the transitional height plane adjacent to N1 neighborhood type. But it did reduce, as Matt mentioned, it reduced when we got the second UDO draft, but it was still above the numbers that we yielded with the conditional zoning. So by and large, it's good. There's some other anomalies within here, but there's nothing that precludes, again, by and large, being able to develop what's being developed and understood as the best development across the city using conditional zoning now by right under the UDO. Next slide. And this is a similar evaluation for non-residential FAR. And the only thing I want to point out here, if you take the time to read through the analysis, is that you will find some outliers, like a huge increase in the amount of non-residential FAR in some of the industrial sites that we looked at, and this was simply because those industrial site projects were not looked at to maximize development, but we were really looking at that to understand that you could build the same thing, which, again, by and large, you can do. And so finally, next slide, please, our three final findings are that, again, by and large, the UDO aligns with the comprehensive plan. So this is getting the city where it needs to go based on the intent of the plan. That the UDO generally provides increase in yields, so that's one key issue, but then balancing that key issue is that the UDO provides a better physical environment, so you're getting the best of both worlds, at least in the way that we've modeled and analyzed this. You're getting better development with higher yields in the appropriate places, and you're ultimately getting a better physical environment throughout the city. Thank you.
Okay, so here we are at the end of the presentation. You've heard updates on the key changes, and you've heard from the community on the second draft, as well as the changes in the second draft. But I thought it would be best if we started out with a discussion of the economic impact analysis and site feasibility analysis for questions. And I'm glad to see that Ms. Ajmira has joined us, Mayor Pro Tem has joined us, And is there anyone else in addition, since we had our introductions? I think that's correct. What I thought I would do is start at the beginning, when we'll go through asking in order. We'll start with our districts and then go to our large. And I'm going to start with Councilmember Eggleston, if there are questions, to be followed by Mr. Graham.
I don't have any questions at this time.
All right, thank you. Mr. Graham?
I don't have any questions either.
All right, Mr. Newton?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you, Madam Mayor. So I have comments, possibly a question interspersed, but I'll get to that. I had certainly comments on the UDO presentation that we were first delivered, but inasmuch as the economic analysis presentation is concerned, I'm still greatly disturbed by the fact that we are speaking in what appears to be generalities. Inasmuch as we're talking about specific areas, I think that one slide might have broken down, like say Caswell, Gibbon, Jay, South, etc. But these are all areas that are closer into the city. I keep bringing this up, and I've said this for years. We have a city that is 310 square miles. That is a large geographic area, and needs extend well beyond maybe the inner loop of the city. And I just feel like we look at, so our approach to planning has been a one-size-fits-all, generality-driven rather than addressing, so generality-driven endeavor rather than addressing the differing needs that we know exist in differing communities and neighborhoods. There is a difference between trade and Harrisburg Road or Shopton Road, for example. And I'm not hearing analysis coming out of these other areas and how the UDO is going to impact those areas. If anything, we completely gloss over it. And this is despite the fact that neighborhoods and leaders within those communities continue to bring this up and to say that they are being left behind and forgotten. So anyhow, I have asked for these types of economic analyses or analysis in these other areas. I recall asking about it in committee, and I was just very disappointed because it seems as though much of the emphasis is in areas that already have existing transit and infrastructure, maybe somewhat blunted or limited in scope in certain areas, but nevertheless more educational, nutritional, and economic options as well than others. And that's by virtue or by result of just how large we are as a geographical region. So anyhow, that's my comment on the economic analysis. I was somewhat disappointed that it wasn't more broad and all-encompassing. And in as much as the UDO presentation was concerned earlier, I was also
I think let's stick to the economic, Mr. Newton.
Sure. If I can reserve.
We'll stick to this one.
Yes, ma'am.
We'll come back. I don't know where the feedback is coming. We'll come back and we'll take each one of those bullets. I don't know what's going on, Ms. Jackson, but we'll figure it out. Okay, so Mr. Newton, would you like to hear Mr. Green? Do you have any comment? You've heard Mr. Newton's comments. Mr. Green or Mr. Prosser, would you have any comment as you've heard from Mr. Newton?
I would just say that you're right. We did have a limited cohort of specific sites, although we did have sites in different parts of the city. But the way we've set this up, it's fairly easy to go back in and model additional sites or additional areas. I think that's embedded in the logic of the UDO. So I think it's pretty easy for us to go back and do more if there are specific areas that you would like to look at.
Yes, sir. I mentioned Harrisburg Road, Shopton Road. I'd be very interested in Plaza Road Extension, maybe even slightly north of there, Rocky River Road. Once again, areas that lack many of the fundamental amenities that are existing elsewhere. And to the extent that they do exist elsewhere, I would agree that I feel like the UDO, possibly even, our comp plan does a good job of addressing the needs, but extending beyond those more amenity-rich areas, I think it does a very poor job and leaves neighborhoods and communities behind. So any sort of economic analysis on the impact of comprehensive growth in those areas that we know is already going to happen, and then add on top of that the growth that is yet to even be, seen, given kind of the deficiencies in these other areas, I think would be very helpful, certainly helpful for me. So I mentioned those roads, and I would also encourage you to reach out to some of the other district reps who have areas that extend kind of beyond that immediate loop around our city. That I've called it in the past, kind of the extra mile or beyond the last mile. Don't know if that is appropriate terminology, but hopefully I'm getting kind of the general sense of what I'm talking about across.
Mr. Newton, you're going to have to mute because it's, there you go. Okay.
Okay, Mr. Newton is muted. Thank you, Mr. Newton. The staff has agreed that if any council member would like to see additional scenarios of the analysis that Mr. Green has done, please just send those to Ms. Craig. So we've got so far Harrisburg Road, Plaza Road, Rocky River Road, any others, please just.
And I would say Shopton as well. And then on that second point, so in as much as the UDO is concerned, and this does seem to be more of a sticking point for me as time goes on, that Tier 1 residential standard for parking minimums has not changed. We're literally talking about eliminating half of all parking spaces in new development. And these are in areas, so once again, when we're talking about kind of differing areas that have differing needs, there's a huge difference between kind of the inner loop and then when you get beyond that inner loop of our city, where tremendous residential growth is already occurring. More will occur under the 2040 comp plan. That will happen by right, but yet we have no public transit options, no other safety-oriented transit amenities or options like sidewalks, bike lanes. These are all on 2-lane roads. We can't pay for current needs across our city, and let alone future ones, and there are no plans to address these areas. And so it just seems very unwise to me to decrease parking minimums in those areas, allowing for even additional residential growth when we know that even today, let alone tomorrow, many of the people in those areas will have no choice but to use vehicles. Not to say that we wouldn't want them to maybe utilize other options, but under the circumstances, I don't really think that such an abrupt change in those areas is very wise. And once again, I think it's inequitable and will leave those communities further behind. So that's my issue in as much as that first presentation is concerned regarding the UDO and these Tier 1 residential parking minimums.
Thank you, Mr. Newton. Any response to that?
I mean, we can provide you a comparison between the ordinance today as it relates to those areas as what's proposed in the second draft, but we listened to the concerns that you all had when we proposed during our last workshop to reduce those minimums, which we went back to our original draft 1 proposed plan. But we'll get you more information.
All right, thank you. Mr. Bakari.
Yes, thanks. I think Mr. Newton is spot on with his comments. And, I've had one meeting, despite almost 2 years of doing this, where I got to walk through some of the models that were the backbone of what we saw today. And I saw fundamentally flawed assumptions where the costs of building and construction, the cost of the ultimate outcomes they're looking for were the same in South Park versus specific neighborhoods in East and West Charlotte. And to Mr. Newton's point, they're not the same. They're different. And if we use the same assumptions, we're going to gloss over the fact that we might be devastating certain parts of town by abolishing single-family zoning. So one slide on the economic impact to affordable housing that abolishing single-family zoning will have, that's all we get. And 5 of us at minimum have been pleading for this information for the better part of 2 years. And for that to be it and glossed over that quickly is pretty disheartening to me. Friday, Steve Harrison from WFAE dropped an article that I hope everyone in this city gets a chance to read. And it's one that reinforces everything several of us have been saying for years now. 4 years ago, Minneapolis abolished single-family zoning. That's they're 4 years ahead of us, and we can look at them because we've modeled a lot of what we're doing based on that national trend that was occurring. Here's a couple excerpts on how that's going, because I think this is really important as it relates to the economic impact analysis we deserve and need. Smart Growth Minneapolis describes the plan as harmful to low-income residents and minorities. They highlight, and I quote, issues that will have a disparate impact upon low-income communities of color. It is clear that the city failed in its duty to effectively engage the communities most impacted by this plan, or to be transparent about the long-term unintended consequences that will ensue, which will likely include housing displacement and gentrification. The American Planning Association, they actually published a study, something we've been asking for 2 years, saying developers are targeting low-income neighborhoods for redevelopment after the 4 years. Not maybe they would, they say they are targeting, which is exactly what we said would happen here. Here's their quote. These findings also suggest that property owners in relatively inexpensive neighborhoods may see the greatest price increases, which can help lessen the gap between property values, the study says. However, the fact that developers are likely to target relatively inexpensive properties compared to the properties around them may lead to a short-term reduction in the supply of relatively low-cost single-family housing. And then MinPost stated, Minneapolis's 2040 comp plan sought to address this problem by elimination of single-family zoning, allow for up to 3 units per property, and as the belief went, it would increase housing supply, and with more units, it would address the affordability crisis and promote desegregation. Exactly what we've been hearing around here for the last 2 years. Yet this has not happened. For one, housing is not a unified but a diverse market. Housing built for the affluent or middle class is not the same as housing built for the poor. All things being equal, developers will build the type of housing that is most profitable for them, and it is not for the poor. And these aren't just statements of actual reality of people's opinions in Minneapolis who've had this for 4 years. The court ordered Minneapolis to cease implementation of their 2040 plan. And they said, you need to cease and desist until the city, in quote, prevails in establishing an affirmative defense. And that's what we've lacked right now. We've said, okay, well, it's fine, it'll probably be fine, but they are saying right now by court order, you cannot do this until you go proactive, affirmatively defend your position of what you're saying is gonna happen, not the otherwise. Yet here we are right now, not having done the actual analysis needed to understand if we're gonna decimate portions of our city, and where they've actually gotten creative is in sleight of hand. Election day is July 26th. The UDO vote is August 26th. We delayed that. And then September 6th is our organizational meeting and our swearing in ceremony when the next council comes in. This was premeditated as a strategy to take a position that many Charlotteans disagree with after the election, but before the next council takes office. In other words, without any accountability. But here's the kicker that they didn't realize, and I say this to every member of this community. Under the clear words of the 2021 law delaying the election, that's SB 722, members-elect can choose to take the oath anytime after they get the certification of election. And the certification of election is going to be no later than August 11th by estimate. So what does that mean? It means abolishing single-family voting was approved with a razor-thin margin last year, 6-5. The voters of Charlotte have an option to vote for a slate that will not approve the UDO as an unintended consequence of their gamesmanship,
I think
and to pass in a late, excuse me, Madam Mayor, I am almost done speaking specifically on the economic impact analysis and the games that you all have played. And that gamesmanship has now put you all in a position where the voters of Charlotte can have a referendum on July 26th and actually say no, single-family zoning will not be abolished, and we will put people in office that will make sure they uphold that. And they only need one vote to do it.
Thank you, Mr. Bakari. I don't quite know how to express. Is there any comment that could help address some of Mr. Bakari's concerns about Minneapolis, flawed assumptions, targeted development, property owners being targeted, and I will not ask you to comment on when our election is being held. So any other comments?
I'll defer to Matt and Laura on a couple of these issues, but I will say I do know the issue in Minneapolis, and it's not quite as quite that straightforward. It has to do with a specific political issue that's tied through an environmental action. But I do think by and large there is value, and I'm speaking, so I work all over the world. I happen to live in Councilperson Newton's district, but my experience globally, not just nationally, but globally, is that a lot of the elements that the UDO is putting into place will actually have the beneficial outcomes, I think, that Mr. Bakari is looking for. Some of this stuff just doesn't happen immediately. And I think that it's probably incumbent upon Matt and myself to go back and pull together some data that might help illustrate this a little bit more clearly. And personally, I apologize for not getting the information that you're asking for in this presentation, but I think that there is plenty of precedent and analysis for this that we can look at as we evaluate the current UDO draft.
All right, Mr. Prosser, any comment?
Yeah, I would just mention when we were looking at the impact of potential redevelopment of single-family homes late last year and early this year, we did revise our approach and incorporate 6 specific product types that ranged in price point and also cost to address specifically Councilmember Bakari's comments about our analysis, and found fairly similar results, which we've provided within the report for the evaluation of the UDO. So we have been trying to hear your comments and provide additional analysis based on your feedback, and we'll continue to do that as possible to support this.
Yeah, and my problem with that is that it's always been editing of the model with the ultimate outcome in mind of what the story that wants to be told. And right now, I think it's the point after almost 2 years of constant battling, constant trying to use logic from an economic impact analysis perspective. I think we're at a point now where we just have to agree that everyone's going to hold firm and keep marching forward. And now it is at a referendum for the citizens of Charlotte on July 26th to decide if single-family zoning will be abolished.
All right, thank you, Mr. Bakari. Mr. Driggs?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. One thing that I would like to see out of this analysis is some sort of a projection of what we think the availability of affordable housing will be based on all of these policies. So a centerpiece of all of this was that we wanted to increase the supply of housing, to make housing more affordable. I think where we are right now is we're entering our third $50 million bond cycle of trust fund. And it's not clear to me that the situation in terms of the housing shortage has improved. We've been in a very difficult and inflationary environment. I get that, but I do think that we ought to have some justification in terms of an expectation of relief on the front of affordable housing as a result of this whole plan, because that was one of the major drivers. I also had asked previously about the economic analysis, whether we take into account HOA agreements. I remember, Matt, you showed us, where you thought the affordable housing might get developed or how much of it might get developed. But HOA agreements and deed restrictions that are currently in place are critical. And it's one more reason why the development, gentrification is likely to accelerate, because those are the most vulnerable neighborhoods, not only in terms of the price point of the housing and the cost of the land, but also in terms of the legal protection they have. I do have a question related to our last week's zoning meeting. We had a number of high-density petitions, and the conversation started on council about, are we really thinking about how that affects congestion? Are we modeling all of this increase in density with any regard to our road system and the capacity that we have to absorb that growth? That's a question.
All right, transportation, I think, Mr. Driggs, that there's going to be and after we finish this section, you'll get comments on the comprehensive transportation item. That's a separate item, and we'll come back after we complete that, if that's okay. Ms. Babson is here. to go through that, and so I think the point is, Mr. Driggs is asking about how how do these two things intersect? And that's the next item on our agenda, Mr. Driggs. Are you okay with allowing some of the council members comment and then come back to that one?
Madam Mayor, I have other questions, but aside from that, I'm not aware of anything in our streets map or other conversations that tells me what I can say to people who live on Providence Road about how the congestion is likely to develop along there. I would just like to see something that right here and right now talks about what we think is going to happen in these very congested areas. So another question I had is on the trees. Are we creating a separate rule book for trees, or are all the requirements about trees going to be in the UDO?
So all of the development-related requirements for trees will be in the UDO. There will be an amendment to the tree ordinance to talk about the property owner decisions, because that's not development-related, but that will follow the same exact adoption schedule. It's just really a matter of where our legal staff recommended those regulations be.
With respect to the affordable housing, are we negotiating? There were some indications that we're going to let them have this much density, or we're going to let them do the N2 density and the N1. Have we actually negotiated with developers to find out what it takes for them to be able to do affordable housing without public investment based on these incentives? Because we made the mistake before of putting the density bonus out there and no one was interested. So do we have reason to believe that the things in the UDO that are meant to stimulate the creation of affordable housing will actually be sufficient to encourage private investment?
Yeah, I can address that first off. And so we, through the process, identify both changes to the bonus menu, as well as this introduction of flexibility of zone district use. So the bonus menu creates different tiers for affordability in terms of the bonus that you get for it, and also creates a modified incentive to try to encourage on-site mixed income development. What we had been hearing from the housing folks is that the fee in lieu for additional height bonus has been working and producing dollars that have gone into the Affordable Housing Fund. And so adjustments that were made were trying to increase the opportunities to either pay the fee in lieu or provide on-site in different variety of contexts and levels of affordability. In terms of the flexibility of zone districts, I think that was a really substantial change that was made. What we heard from the specific affordable housing developers that were in our groups, and like I said, we had a specific group that was just people that are active in building affordable housing, both nonprofit, private developers, was that often for things like a low income housing tax credit project, increased density isn't something that is valuable to them. Because they have a sort of set number of units that work well for that financing tool. And really what was most beneficial was flexibility in the standards that they could use. And so what the second draft UDO allows is really a unique opportunity to use zone districts that are in different place types that better support affordable project designs. And so that if you're in an area that's calling for certain urban provisions that make building an affordable housing project more costly or difficult, you can use a less dense zone district to build your project, which will address some of those issues. As well as things as, one thing we heard about was the road to nowhere, where affordable projects had to build a sort of a stub road for a future connection. And one of the examples of the provisions included is you no longer have to actually build that road right away until that connection is needed, and don't merely have to preserve that right away. And so what we've tried to do, working with the developers specifically, is to identify those instances and those places where increased flexibility and reduction in cost would be most beneficial. And I think we've identified some very substantive changes that can help those projects.
I think the holy grail is when we get for-profit developers to include affordable housing in their developments based on incentives that we offer. So I hope we're going to be able to do that.
Yeah, and I agree with you, Councilmember Driggs. We pushed, David and I pushed for some changes to further incentivize those on-site projects. And it may be that you need additional or more generous incentives to further push that. And I think that's worth monitoring as this is implemented, if anybody's taking advantage of those or not. And if they're not, perhaps it would warrant relooking at that and identifying some additional changes or more generous incentives to push the private development community to include those units.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Driggs. So, Ms. Ajmira?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Couple of questions. First, I want to thank Allison and her entire team. I have had multiple sessions to understand all the changes that were made to heritage trees, parking and EVs to address the concerns that we have had over past several months. I certainly appreciate that. Second question, well, first question I have here is, Matt, could you just elaborate on the scope of your economic analysis and how you went about scoping that, and what was the process? Did you have the ultimate outcome in your mind as you were scoping this analysis out?
No, I mean, the scope of the analysis was really 3 major points. So one was to identify the changes that we thought were impactful on development yield or development cost. And that was a pretty laborious process, and it was only accomplished through the generous donation of hours and effort from the development community. I'd like to commend their efforts in helping us develop this plan. It was essential that they were willing to invest the time that they did. And like I mentioned, we had over 20 meetings with them in various contexts, as well as I know there's groups that have been meeting weekly with city staff to go through issues. And so first we documented the ones that we collectively thought were impactful. And then both David and I went through a pretty robust analysis to try to evaluate each of those issues, looking at both prototypical sites and case study sites to identify which ones were more or less impactful, and then document that to city staff and back to the development community, which fed directly into changes in the second draft UDO, which is really the third part, was to identify recommendations that we thought would help alleviate concerns. And so really the scope of the change that you guys have taken in terms of consolidating the ordinances to one unified development ordinance and the shift of not only the policy map, but into a whole new set of zone districts is a pretty sizable change. So I don't know how you could possibly have any idea what the potential outcomes of those would be. And we did find some pretty significant barriers. The heritage tree issue was a humongous issue that we needed to work with on, and we have a pretty favorable change, I think, in terms of allowing development, but trying to achieve the goals of the community of preserving that tree canopy. And there's other ones too that we've identified, but the scope of this was way too large to have any sort of set idea of what the outcome would be.
Thank you. No, I think that is very helpful. So is it fair to say that there was no ultimate outcome in mind throughout this process?
No, other than to help make it better.
Okay, I appreciate that. There is a lot of analysis done on the cost, which is great because we want to be mindful of not increasing the cost of building while also addressing some of our other priorities that we have, from affordable housing, tree preservation, and some of the other priorities that our city has. I'm trying to really understand some of these changes, especially heritage tree, parking, EVs. What is the impact we are looking at from the environment perspective? And what would it cost if we were not to do the things that we are intending to do or planning to do to preserve our heritage trees while also ensuring that we have economic opportunities for our residents, that we are incentivizing affordable housing, we are incentivizing electric vehicles. I would just like your thoughts on that.
Yeah, there are a lot of benefits, and I think the UDO does a good job of illustrating for each sort of section of the UDO the rationale for the standards that are within it and the outcomes and the benefits that it's trying to generate. And so each section of the UDO has that sort of rationale section that lays out in pretty clear terms why the community is providing the standards and what are the outcomes they're looking for. And so a lot of those benefits that you mentioned are ones that are not quantified, at least from our perspective, but are impactful. And I think would take pretty robust analysis on almost each issue to really highlight those benefits. And I think that's it. Really, David's finding and our finding is the reflection that the UDO is really doing a good job of implementing the vision that's in the comprehensive plan, illustrates how there's a direct connection between the values of the community and the benefits they see in things like the urban tree canopy and increased connectivity and what have you. And I think we have an UDO that does a good job of trying to translate those added benefits without overly burdening the development community, specifically within the implementation of that. And like I said, the sort of the yield, the trade-off between potential yield, the amount of development they can build, and increased costs is something that we were cognizant of the entire time, and not wanting to create an environment where the cost was not outweighed by the yield or the benefit that was generated. And illustrating that specifically to the development community, and realizing that there are community-wide benefits as well that are not necessarily quantified.
No, I think your team have done a great job with analyzing the cost. I would like us to quantify the other benefits that we are trying to address through this UDO, whether it's affordable housing or environmental impact. So truly give an accurate picture of what this UDO attempts to do. And that's all I have. And I know I think Councilmember Watlington had also asked for that at our last UDO workshop, and I haven't seen a follow-up to that question. And she had asked similarly that how do we quantify some of these benefits that we are trying to tackle? Thank you.
All right, thank you, Ms. Hajimura. Thank you, Ms. Hajimura. Our, Mr. Phipps, do you have any questions or comments?
Yes. I guess in the presentation that was just given, it showed how the UDO comports with the comprehensive vision plan, and it talks about different aspects of it, and it makes mention of the increases in cost for development in certain areas, and I'm wondering, because that could be, I mean, it seems like it's already turning into I guess a legitimate talking point in terms of will the generation of this plan result in increased costs and really diminish our ability to get some of the things we want in terms of increased affordable housing opportunities and such. But to piggyback off of what Ms. Hajimura said, I'm interested in knowing if we didn't do this, I mean, if we somehow maintain the status quo after all of this work that we've done, isn't there a cost to that also? So how does that cost compare? Because right now we're operating under conditions that we don't have an approved UDO yet. But this is something that we're aspiring to. So, I mean, what is the final analysis? Does this effort that we're going to, I mean, it seems to, I mean, from what I'm hearing, the consensus seemed to be that it's an overall improvement over our current conditions. But can we definitively say that in the face of projected cost increases that would accrue through the implementation of this? So, and I think that corresponds to what Ms. Ashmira was saying. What kind of benefits, I mean, what we are trying to achieve with this plan in terms of open space and things like that, which, you know, tree preservation, which we want to preserve our canopy. I mean, what is it, I mean, the trade-offs, are we saying then that this is the direction that gives us the greatest benefit right now? That's one question I have. And then this other question, I mean, this other comment that I have on what Mr. Newton was saying about the Far East areas and such, I'm wondering, I mean, can we really compare right now the urban areas of Charlotte when you contrast them with some of our rural areas that still have vast tracts of land, still have dairy farms along Rocky River, even along Hood Road or whatever? I mean, I've been in Back Creek now for 19 years. We were annexed to the city in 2003. And you know, and we're certainly still waiting for some infrastructure. But I don't know that, I wonder how appropriate is it for us to really compare the urban core with some of these urban areas that still were originally a part of ETJ areas that are moving into the city. I mean, certainly there's a certain amount of time element that's going to take to get those areas interspersed with both commercial, retail, and residential to get them to a point where they would have the density to be able to justify a lot of the activities that we want to see. So I can understand Mr. Newton's frustration, but I wonder how balanced it is when you compare it against other parts of the city. So, you know, those are my those are my comments. I mean, and the question there was, you know, what's the cost of not implementing this UDO? I mean, where are we now? I mean, you know, are we better off or whatever? So that's what all I have right now. Thank you.
I believe Mr. Prosser would be best to address your question of the consequences of doing nothing, the trade-offs, the costs. I don't know, but I do want to, we have Mayor Pro Tem as our last speaker, and then I want to do a time check to see where we're going with what we want to do, because we do have some really significant work to do. But I know that people have schedules. So, Mr. Prosser, could you address Mr. Phipps' question, and then we'll go to Mayor Pro Tem.
Yeah, I think one of the most impactful changes here is we're trying, the UDO is trying to create environments where projects are built more often by right. And what you have currently is a situation where a lot of the benefits that, or amenities that folks want to see in new development projects, whether it's, you know, sidewalk connectivity or open space, green area, tree preservation, that stuff in many cases, and we tried to illustrate that in the analysis, is often negotiated through conditional rezoning or process currently. And so what you're having to do is every project, for lack of a better word, sort of fight for all these benefits in that negotiation for the rezoning. And what the UDO sets to do is just set a baseline, and you can see those in David's charts specifically to the green area and open space. Let's set a consistent baseline of what's required for green area and for open space, and require that, and try to push for more by right development that's built how we want it to. And so projects, no matter where they are in the city, if they're in the core or on the edge, have specific standards that meet the ideals that we want for different projects. And I will say that we've evaluated every zoning district that is in the plan. And so zone districts that it would apply only sort of in more lower density ex-urban areas were evaluated just as they were for the more core areas as well. And so there was an evaluation of the variety of impacts, especially through the prototypical sites of what the challenges are. I think there's a future opportunity through the community area planning process to take what the high level vision of the comprehensive plan has and specifically apply that to specific geographies in terms of the improvements that are needed to achieve the values and the outcomes that the community would like to see in areas like the Far East. And so additional opportunity to guide investment. And so at least with the UDO, we have a framework that's providing development projects that fit with what the community wants. How we improve the conditions through physical improvements and capital projects is outside, I'd say, of the UDO scope, but equally as important and something to consider as well.
Thank you, Mr. Prosser.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Phipps. Mayor Pro Tem?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Thank you, everybody, for the presentation. I think, well, let me ask my first question. Is it fair to say, Matt, you just said it's a framework. Is it fair to say it is not law until the small area plan is completed? That's probably for staff. Because I think that's a really important point.
Yeah, I'll let staff mention, but some of these benefits, especially the density and increased yield, will come as a result of the translation of the zoning, and ultimately that'll be guided through some different processes. And I think Laura will probably speak to that.
Ms. Craig or Ms. Harmon?
We're actually recommending that the UDO take effect in June 1st of next year. Certainly, we'll be going back and looking at aligning zoning as part of the community area planning process. So we'll have a lot of conditional zoning that'll remain in place until that process begins, and then all of those rezonings, anything that we propose, will come back through council for approval or not.
So I'm a little confused by that. If you had a development on Harrisburg Road, to Matt's point, a proposal, and it could be by right through the UDO, but it wouldn't fly in the small area plan, but you don't know it yet because the small area plan hasn't been done, can that project get done?
It would depend on the zoning of that property, just as it would today without the community area plan. So if the property is already zoned in today's world, the zoning would translate to a new district that would allow that to happen, but it would happen regardless of whether or not the UDO is adopted if the zoning is appropriate and the market is there for the property. So the UDO really doesn't change whether or not a development would occur.
Okay, I think, and I know that I'm glad to see that we're still talking about conditional rezonings because we're going to have them. My concern, though, is that staff has the ability to tell a developer, somebody who applies, no, that's not going to work, we're not going to allow that. And council might not even know. And we've had that happen in the TOD where they can be told, well, that doesn't fit, you can go ahead and do that because it's the TOD, whereas it's a rezoning that council would not have approved, or vice versa. So I'm a little bit uncomfortable with saying, well, we can do it as a conditional, because there will be some people who don't really know that they could come to council and say, we're being told we can't do this. And I think it's very important for the areas that Matt and Ed have brought up, where some of those roads, and Victoria, I'm sure, would say the same thing if she was on about Steel Creek. Some of these roads are outliers in the sense that there's no help coming for them. And I do think they need to either be flagged or somehow given the ability to have some nimbleness with how we approach them, because they are different than other roads, and they're not going to be next to a light rail stop where we hope everybody will move over to the light rail or to whatever. But I don't know how we get past that without being very clear that there is another path to turn down or to alter what would be a buy rate. So I'm struggling with that one a little bit. My other comments would be, I don't quite understand what you mentioned, the open space requirement. It was 25 by 25 and then it was eliminated, or what was that comment?
Yeah, there was a requirement in the first draft of the open space having a specific size of a minimum of 25 feet in width and length. And that was, our analysis, and specifically David's analysis, found that to be pretty onerous to fit that sort of large of a space without some flexibility. And so what the second draft does is allows for greater flexibility of the size of the open space, as long as it meets criteria for what is good open space or a usable open space, without having to have a specific size parameter to it. So relatively minor change, but it is impactful. And David's analysis was trying to find that 25 by 25 spot sometimes was impactful on the project design. I don't know if, David, you want to elaborate.
It just simply had the unintended consequence of diminishing the opportunity to do small-scale development. That was the issue. And so we came up with a solution where we got the same amount of open space, but it allowed us to do smaller building development, whether residential or commercial. So stronger street edge, things like that.
But it's the same amount of open space?
It is. There are a lot of these issues, or a number of these issues, that we dug into at the sort of technical level. And so just a very simple way to imagine this is we all want, in sort of urban neighborhoods, we want buildings that all face the street, but there's a requirement for commercial open space that it had to be directly adjacent to the street, which makes sense, but there was a dimensional requirement that had to be 25 feet wide. So what you can imagine is when you get a drive and that open space, you've got a parcel that's 100 feet wide, half of that is open space, so you get building, open space, building, open space. And what we were trying to do was allow more flexibility so we could have development in some of these smaller projects that was more like we'd see on a neighborhood shopping street, for instance. It was really just that. It didn't diminish the amount of open space in any way whatsoever.
Okay. I think that's probably it for my questions and comments. Again, I don't know how we get there, but I do think there needs to be more data around a road that might be similar to another road, but isn't, because it's already got a lack of infrastructure, and we know there's not much we can do. Thank you.
So we have this, there's a council committee meeting that starts at 12:30, so we have about 10 minutes. We will adjust the agenda for tonight, which I believe we start at 4 o'clock, and have the presentation on the UDO and the Comprehensive Transportation Review at that time, since several of you have other council committee meetings that start. But before we go there, I thought we would try to cover the procedural issues around this, and if we need to, we can have the TAP committee look at the procedural issues, but making sure Allison, Ms. Craig goes through and explains what they are and how it works. But we will figure out a way to work in the UDO and the Comprehensive Transportation Review work following the zoning meeting, but before the public forum tonight. Okay?
All right, thank you, Madam Mayor. I'm actually going to turn this over to Laura to talk about the items that will come before you on July the 11th.
Yes, and this is, if we get to at the end of the presentation, but on the 11th, we will be bringing you all, there you go, the Unified Development Ordinance, having a public hearing on that and related procedures, the public hearing on the revised tree ordinance, and then public comments on the Charlotte Streets Manual, including the streets map. So you will have 2 public hearings and a public comment session, all on these related items.
Lauren, if you could just
Make a
explain.
quick comment. We also have a TAP meeting that day. So that's an opportunity for council members also to get more information if they want to join us for that meeting.
Okay. All right, so it's 12:20 now, and I believe we've covered everything, and I don't want to start the UDO and the comprehensive transportation work until we can actually do it as a complete report, as well as having time for questions. And I do want to recognize that the Great Neighborhoods Committee meeting is coming up and give you a chance to have a break in between that. So this meeting for the UDO work session is now adjourned, and we will re-adjourn for those that need to be there this evening, and we'll get a new schedule out of when that when the presentation of the UDO and the transportation review project will come up on the agenda tonight. Okay? Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.